Hi, good afternoon. I'm Lisa Petrides, and I'm delighted to be here today as a moderator for our panel, Preparing Students for a Changing Workforce. This is about K-12 students, and as we think about how school systems are really helping students adapt to these rapid changes in the workplace and other impacts of rapid digitization, we really want to look at how we're incorporating digital skills into the curriculum, how we're building employer partnerships, and K-12 schools across the country are innovating with career and technical education to prepare students for future careers. And here we are in the middle of a pandemic as well. So I'm delighted to have our two panelists this morning. Again, I'm Lisa Petrides, and I'm founder and CEO of the Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management in Education. We're a nonprofit dedicated to democratizing access to education. And this afternoon, we have with us Stan Litow, who is the President Emeritus from the IBM Foundation, and Chuck Ambrose, who is President and CEO of KnowledgeWorks. So, good afternoon to both of you. So, this afternoon, what we're going to do, the goal of our session is really to look at K-12, the K-12 system, and how it can be used to really establish a solid learning foundation to prepare students for this rapidly changing future of work. So we're going to speak both to Stan and Chuck about the development of soft skills, experiential learning, early career exploration, all of the things that really are behind what we need to do for this changing workforce. So I would like to give each of you just a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves. Stan, why don't you go ahead and go first?
Sure. As Lisa said, I was president of the IBM Foundation and vice president for corporate affairs and citizenship at the IBM company. Before that, I was deputy schools chancellor for the city of New York, the New York City Public Schools. And now I'm professor and innovator in residence at Duke University. And I'm delighted to participate with you this afternoon. These are issues that I care a great deal about.
Thank you, Stan. Chuck?
I'm just grateful as well, and certainly the common bonds that Lisa, you and Stan, and your fingerprints in regards to thinking differently, not only about pathways but perhaps seamless pathways. I know our session topic is more K-12, but as President and CEO of KnowledgeWorks, where we really look at systems level change through personalized competency-based learning, I would encourage us to really think about kind of following the learner, because our students are finding these pathways, many of them equipped to meet 21st century skills in ways that I, as a former college president for 20 years, probably will never gain the competencies. And I may be looking to my kids and grandkids to help me gain those competencies to stay contemporary with where the world is. But it is incredible when we really think about the learner agency and empowerment and the potential for not just knowledge, skills, and dispositions, but those life and work skills that really do bridge skills from school to work. And so grateful to be a part of this conversation, especially Lisa, with you and Stan.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, so what's just to follow on that, what's so interesting, there have been several reports and studies over the last couple of years that have really, I think, unequivocally shown us that the jobs that are going to exist in 2030 haven't even really been invented yet. And in order to best prepare our students for what is certainly an uncertain future of work, the question I want to pose to both of you are, what types of skills and experiences should we be developing in K-12 students that are going to still be relevant when they enter the workforce? Chuck, we'll go ahead and start with you.
That's such a great way to frame, and as you said, many reports, and I'm especially grateful to the invitation from College Promise, right? So if we emphasize on the promise part of what education is really meant to deliver, it's very important for us to consider, especially the participants in this conversation, what problem are we really trying to solve? And as we think about it, now, especially in the midst of twin pandemics, of disparities across systems as well as COVID, We do know, and matter of fact, I think Strata referenced this week, uh, really the value proposition offered by all of education is being challenged, right? College takes too long, costs too much. But more particularly, there's a gap, right? There's a skills gap between how we've traditionally thought about credentials and licensure up against, again, some may call it soft skills, but it's certainly those well-roundedness skills that business and industry and work refine in people so keenly to enhance performance and meaning and purpose. But then last, and perhaps most incredible, to do it perhaps in a way that doesn't encumber those learners with the student debt that now has gone over $1.7 trillion, right? So if we think about solving for those problems with the student first, of cutting the time to a degree, certainly cutting the cost, but eliminating the skills gap, many of those elements kind of fall into alignment and much more is possible. And so perhaps disruption, perhaps the challenges, perhaps the innovation that learners can bring to the equation puts us in another place to really think about what the future of both work, but education blended together can look like.
And I think that's so important as we're starting to really touch on this issue of how are we aligning the life and the work to learning for the students, and really how does the system respond to that? Stan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts are that the workplace has always changed. The skills required in the workplace have always changed. What's different is the pace of change. The pace has accelerated so significantly that we're going to have to respond for our young people, for the students, and help that pace of change to be able to accommodate in the kinds of change that we need to take place in our K to 12 and higher ed systems. And K to 12 and higher ed cannot be in silos. They cannot be separate. If you look at where the jobs are that are developing, they will require post-secondary education, no question about it. And for students who only get a high school diploma or don't get a high school diploma, the world of work is going to be, it's just not going to work. It's just not going to work. Now, when we talk about the skills and the workplace skills, I had close to a 25-year career at a company called IBM. And when you looked across the variety of different entry-level jobs at a company like IBM, there was certain commonality in the kinds of skills that were required. Problem solving, it's not a soft skill, it's an essential skill. Writing skills, presentation skills, collaboration skills. These are the kinds of things that allow somebody to adapt and learn when the specific job changes. Do people need some specific workplace skills depending upon the job category that they're applying for, whether it's technology or healthcare or banking and finance, you name it? There are areas where there are going to be growth. But those, what I would characterize as essential skills, not soft skills, are absolutely critical. Now, what we need to learn in our K to 12 system is not necessarily to change our curriculum, because an academic curriculum is critically important, but how the curriculum is taught could incorporate those essential skills. And then we have to look at how we can make sure that our young people not only are getting those skills, but they are not just skill level, but they're college ready. And that's critically important because we can't exist if significantly large numbers of young people graduate with a high school diploma, enroll in college, and then can't complete. One part of it, obviously, is the financial issue. I agree with Chuck 100%. We have to address the escalating cost of college in a significant way. But then we have to make sure that our young people are college ready and can complete. And that's going to involve a reshaping of things that don't work, like remedial education and the kinds of supports that young people need. But we can make this work. We just have to be convinced that we have to change and escalate the process of change.
I really appreciate that, Stan, and I appreciate sort of the reframing of what we would call soft skills, because it always seemed like the added on piece, right? That wasn't the most important piece. And in fact, they are essential. And I think what we're seeing now, and I think what you've so well articulated is, in fact, these are essential now. They're not nice to have; they are absolutely essential. And and college ready must include those as well, in addition to the academic side. So thank you for that. Um, what's really interesting, of course, is here we are in the middle of a pandemic, and COVID-19 has drastically changed how and where our students learn. Um, I'd like to ask you both about, how should these programs that are targeting career development in the K-12 system adjust to meet these evolving learning environments? And if you have examples, what adaptations have you seen with the programs that you have either led or helped support? Stan, we'll start with you this time.
Sure. Well, I think that the pandemic is a crisis. We're in a crisis. Our schools shut down. Students went to remote learning. Some people thought, well, remote learning is fine until we open our schools. But the data is showing that remote learning is not the same as classroom learning, and that such a large number of young people are not participating in remote learning because they don't have a device or they don't have connectivity, or if they are participating, the quality of that remote learning is not up to the standard that we thought it could be. So we need to reshape what we are thinking about in terms of remote learning. When our schools open, remote learning will be something that will have to continue, but we're going to have to significantly raise its quality. And that's where we have to have an opportunity to change what's being offered. We have to make our remote learning opportunities far more interactive. We've got to be able to use up to date technology tools and skills to give young people an opportunity to interact with each other and with their instructional faculty. And we need to support our faculty to be able to help understand how to get the best out of remote learning. So, this is a critical challenge, and we're going to need some help from the federal government to be able to step up to the plate and really understand this is not a district by district, school by school problem. This is a national problem. And then from the private sector standpoint, one of the things that's critically important in terms of developing the skills needed to enter the workforce are internship opportunities. And those were frozen because young people didn't have an opportunity to participate in those. And employers need to step up and be able to recast those internship opportunities so that they can proceed in a remote kind of fashion. I was very pleased that my former employer, IBM, stepped up to the plate and announced 1,000 paid internships for all the students in their P-TECH programs. P-TECH is a program to better prepare young people for the 21st century jobs, and it combines high school and college. But internships are critically important to that. The students who participate in those internships, they reinforce the skills that they've learned, and they're able to create the opportunity to be able to enter the workforce with the skills they need. Other companies need to do the same. They need to step up to the plate and offer those kinds of internships, and that would be critically important. Private sector also needs to challenge their employees to provide mentoring opportunities. People who are in the workforce have an opportunity to share their knowledge and their skills with young people, not just in college, but for students who are in high school and K to 12 settings. And that's an opportunity that can be really used to be able to expand remote internship opportunities, mentoring opportunities, and really connect the workplace. If such a large number of our workers are going to be working remotely, they're going to have an opportunity to share their work experience, their mentorship with young people to create a more seamless pathway from school to college to career. That's what we try to do with the P-TECH program that, as I said, we created. It's almost 10 years old now at this point, with over 200 schools across the United States and globally. But that's one model. I just think we need the employers to really step up to the plate and really respond to this challenge by responding with the mentorship and the internships that are critically important to reinforce those essential workplace skills.
Yeah, thank you, Stan. And I've seen some numbers as high as from low income students that 35% of those students today don't have access to the technology or the Wi-Fi that they need to actually participate in remote learning. So we have some bigger, some bigger issues here also that are not directly part of the education system, but are larger societal issues that have to come together. And I think, in fact, our major corporations in the workplace are going to have to, shoulder some of that responsibility with education to get us there. I just wanted to add too, you talked about the importance of internships. Those are critically important. And I think we're seeing a lot more too in the workforce readiness area around apprenticeships. And I think we're going to see a much bigger emphasis. And been some really great studies recently that have looked at that as the opportunity and how to connect the education and workforce pieces more solidly together. Of course, we have some issues there too. I think I saw a recent study about apprenticeships that only, this was in California, only about 7% of those kind of workforce career apprenticeships go to women. So we have our work cut out for us. Again, the pandemic didn't create these issues, but has certainly highlighted them. Cheka, I'd like to turn it over to you. The same question. Here we are in this pandemic, things have drastically changed. How should these programs targeting career development in K-12 adjust? What do they need to do to adjust for their learning environments? And then again, any kind of adaptations you've seen or observed?
Yeah, and I would hold up a resource that we have at KnowledgeWorks every 3 years. Our strategic foresight team has a forecast for the future of learning. And in the midst of systemic challenges like pandemics and certainly social justice, um, as Stan mentioned, and I'm grateful for the work of IBM and PTech, because from a practitioner standpoint in Missouri, with the Missouri Innovation Campus that really seek to align a P16 accelerated pathway model, I think beyond the school, and Stan extended that not only to the public support, but also the private sector support. One of the things that our teams do in partnership with states and local districts is really think about the development of a true learning community. And certainly the embrace of our own local communities around challenges like public health, certainly social issues like presenting systemic response to anti-racism and other things. There's an element of us working together much more aggressively and thinking about learning differently. Just opening up those internships in the midst of a pandemic, if a student has learner agency and has the ability to know where their proficiencies and their skill development is, they may weather through this, right, in a virtual hybrid model. But again, if there's a digital divide, if there's a wealth divide, a race divide in terms of access to those tools, then the private sector and others in their community have to step forward. Our chief learning officer is one of the real innovators in the practice work for personalized learning, a former superintendent in Maine. Tells the story about his son going out in the midst of snow barefooted to meet the garbage man outside his house. And he said, well, he noticed that his son was engaged in this conversation and was trying to say hydraulics. And really, the sanitation officer there with the local community had some real learning that he was providing. And this is not just for high school age students, but can even go into the earlier grades. Was giving him a lesson, and the former superintendent said to the sanitation worker, said, "Well, this is very interesting. Well, we're in partnership with our local school." And we have some competencies that we're actually trying to teach as we engage in our community. Well, he was telling the school superintendent this, right? And the superintendent was so proud, he didn't realize he was talking to the school superintendent, right? But learning literally is happening everywhere. And especially in the midst of a pandemic, it needs to happen obviously safely. And Stan's right that human interaction is so critical to the development of people. But if in fact we think differently about the classroom, where almost the workplace, the manager, the engineer becomes the teacher, the learner becomes part of the community competencies. There's efficiencies where everybody wins. And actually, there's probably more resources available than we even consider about bringing into the learning environment, even in the midst of some of the challenges that states and local districts, higher ed is going to feel. So we're going to have to find those deficiencies and work more closely together. And I think that is really, considering what's possible, one of the great ways to consider what the future will look like in a much more equitable way.
I wonder, Chuck, if you could say a bit more, and Stan also, you just brought up, I think, one of the most, pivotal points here is around what is going to happen around competencies and skill mastery. And it's something that we've been talking about, and there are some great examples, which you might talk about, that we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years. We've seen some of that on the K-12 side with high school graduation. We've seen some of it at the higher ed level with institutions like Western Governors University. But they're still sort of they're not the norm, right? They're the exception. And I think this idea of how regions and states are going to be able to align the workforce to these competencies is something that we're just, really starting to think about in a very pragmatic way. And how might we put that into action, or how have you seen examples of that you might share with us?
Especially Lisa, with the potential of the accelerated pathway programs, when you actually can bring, and I know Jamie Marasotis opened this meeting up really thinking about redefining work as learning. Um, that it opens up the possibilities to really bring those competencies to life in ways that are accelerated and magnified, right? Not only to high school graduation or a college credential licensure, micro credential, but more importantly, and I think what's crystallizing now during COVID is purpose to work, right? What am I going to do? How am I going to use these knowledge, skills, and dispositions to the kinds of difference I want to make in my future? And I'll just hold this up real quickly because one of my heroes is a young man named Josh Adams. He was a sophomore in high school in Blue Springs, Missouri. He's talented, both with technology and graphic design. He went out and his high school counselor got him an internship at Hallmark. He finished high school with enough dual credits to have completed an associate's degree. I was walking across campus one day and I said, "Hey, Josh, how's your journey going?" And he says, "Well, great, Dr. Ambrose. I'm about ready to graduate." I said, "Well, Josh, you're only, aren't you going to be a sophomore next year?" He said, "Yeah, not only did I bring enough dual credits in to complete, as a sophomore, that I'm already hired by Hallmark because the internship they provided has given me that opportunity." Well, systemically, Lisa, if we can take those kinds of opportunities to not only provide the credentialing and acknowledgement of what they're learning in high school, but what that internship and work brings to the equation, and actually give them the credit without necessarily charging them for it or having them incur debt. Josh was a 21-year-old, fully employed with a bachelor's degree, and able to really think forward without the encumbrance of debt, right? So, and now we call that PTech or other programs that actually are changing the system to align differently. And I think Stan mentioned it as one of the absolute keys, more of a seamless pathway of learning, how we can work together. And there's all kinds of advantages to the employer.
Yeah, I think first of all, I think we have to acknowledge that we have great examples of success when we sit down and talk about, are there examples of success? I could talk to you about the P-TECH program, the fact that college completion rates are 400% higher than the national average, that it's dealing with a population of low-income students. There's no screen to get into the schools; they're open enrollment, and students are actually completing college, moving on to career opportunities in a really effective way. But even if it grows from one school to 200 schools, or from hundreds of students to thousands and tens of thousands or 100,000, it's not the scale that we are looking for. And to scale up the examples of success, we need to look at the barriers to scalability. So when we talk about internships, for example, which I think is critically important in reinforcing those workplace skills. Back in the 1960s, we had a program called Federal College Work Study. It still exists. It provides federal subsidy for college students who are in need of financial resources to pay their tuition. Perhaps our federal college work study initiative should be radically reshaped and expanded so that students in high school could have opportunities to have subsidized internships in the private sector to get the skills they need. When the Johnson administration did that back in the 1960s, it was an innovative program. It's existed for decades and decades, but the resources provided by the federal government are minimal, absolutely minimal. $1 billion US wide. Take it from a billion to 10 billion. Make it a significant program. Provide an opportunity for not just a few students to have the opportunity to have internships, but make that part of the high school experience, because that's critically important in reinforcing those skills. And when we talk about financial support, why shouldn't the Pell Grant program be radically expanded, restructured so that students in early college programs or P-TECH type programs where they take why should they have to struggle state by state to get the resources for tuition? Let's recognize the fact that affordability is not a program that begins at 1 year or 1 month or one process in going from school to college. If we want to make it seamless, let's provide that kind of financial resource and start off in the high school level. And then, if we want our employers to be actually involved in the development of these programs, let's find a way to bring them to the table and put a challenge to them to provide the internships, to provide the mentoring, to provide the career opportunities. You mentioned earlier, Lisa, the apprenticeship program. That's a program that really needs to be embraced. How many students, how many young people, how many adults are involved in apprenticeship programs across the United States? Under 50,000. In a large state like New York, 5,000. This should be, apprenticeship 2.0. We should provide an opportunity to engage much larger numbers of employers, make apprenticeship programs much more affordable and able for lots more, not just young people to be involved, but all people to be involved. So, as we now think about a different way that the federal government could help involve an economic recovery, but also respond to the needs of young people and not just push people into low wage jobs. This is an opportunity for us to have a real federal leadership in being able to promote school to college to career in a much more effective way. And I really think this is not something that could be left to local schools or local school districts or college by college. This is something that needs a national response. And as we think about the next phase of a stimulus package or the next phase of what the federal government is going to do, if we want this opportunity and we want it to address the challenge of diversity and inclusion, there's going to have to be leadership at the federal level, I believe.
Echoing that, Lisa, and I'd just like to add, because Stan, given the transitions of the next 4 years, and wherever the world ends up, you've got my vote. What he just mandated, or at least suggested as perhaps the federal, perhaps added to that, would be some incentivizing, right, for those internships and apprenticeships. I mean, if you really want to incentivize the private sector, that would be a value add that would have public benefit. But the only thing, at least I wanted to mention, is equal to, and perhaps some of those inhibitors that Stan mentioned, if you take that down to a state policy level, there are more silos within state policy and state funding that just do not recognize the accelerating opportunities that now learners are presenting in high school, dual credits, certainly the high school to college continuum, and not to mention kind of the funding cliff that higher education was already under the pre-COVID. When most states funding higher education at kind of the year 2000 level of public funding, trying to keep up with these contemporary needs of resources, both capital and otherwise, that students are actually required to have. So I totally agree, Stan, on the federal, and you couple that with the intentionality that states could bring, both to getting inhibitors out of students' way, but also the funding realignment to make certain. And there are glimmers of hope, right? I mean, profiles of a graduate in South Carolina that has outcome competencies that pathways can be aligned to, but scale, and that is the challenge.
I want to just thank you for that, Chuck, and I want to put an exclamation point after what you both said. I also just want to push a little bit further on what those barriers and inhibitors have been, in addition to not having the widespread federal support, for example, in the state silos as you described them, Chuck. Um, on the other hand, and not on the other hand, but in addition to, you know, what have been the barriers? We have education institutions, across the country. We have workforce. We have corporations and small businesses that could benefit from these kinds of things. What have been some of those barriers? Um, is it the culture? The kind of the culture differences between sort of the workforce and the education systems, because even if a lot of federal monies and initiatives are put into this, what are those things that in fact have perhaps prevented some of this change from happening?
Well, let's start off with the fact that this challenge of college readiness has some very significant barriers. So, number one, there isn't an alignment between high school courses and college courses. So, this is something that needs to be addressed. We can't just sit back and watch, a very large percentage of young people who graduate with a high school diploma have to take non-credit bearing remedial courses at a cost of billions of dollars because their high school diploma did not make them college ready. So let's think about engaging the K-12 system and our higher education system to be able to align our courses. In the P-TECH program, we call it a scope and sequence, where the high school courses and the college courses are actually connected together. And what results from that, not one student in a P-TECH program takes a remedial course. So we can take the resources that we're spending on remediation and we can invest it more effectively in providing that kind of scope and sequence. So our high school courses are connected to our college courses. So a larger percentage of students who have a high school diploma are actually college ready. And we need to really take an opportunity to engage our college faculty in the high schools, to be able to teach in the high schools, not just some courses, but do it in a very systemic kind of way. And these things are the barriers that make college and high school siloed and make them very, very separate. And then the third part of the silo is career, not just job, but career. And we have an opportunity to engage more of the people in the private sector, to engage in our colleges and in our high schools. Look, we have a significantly large number of people who are in the workforce who are at risk of losing their jobs because they don't have the education and skills. A company like AT&T, and I wrote about this in my book, they had about 100,000 employees who were going to get laid off because they were working on hardware. And they looked at the opportunity. Should they lay them off and hire new people with software skills, or should they invest their own money? And they did, $250 million, to be able to reskill and retrain those workers. And that's an opportunity to really engage the private sector in a really significant kind of way. So I think there are the barriers. And the question is, don't have one workaround in a little model program that breaks the rules in one instance. Let's look at the opportunity to take down those barriers and confront the fact that we have racial inequity in our systems. It happens in our higher education systems, our K to 12 system. We don't have an equitable funding formula. When we look at the schools that get the least amount of resources, they tend to be the schools that serve low income and children of color. So that's where I say we need to have leadership on these issues. I agree with Chuck that a lot of the actual implementation happens at a state level and at a local level, but what is happening as a consequence of the pandemic is our states are struggling from a financial circumstance. They're struggling to maintain the kind of financial resources that are needed to be able to address the skills crisis. Before the pandemic, we talked about a skills crisis. Now it's skills crisis 2.0. And that's why I come back to the federal leadership to remove these barriers. Some of it requires resources. A lot of it does, by the way. And some of it involves reshaping what we're doing. CTE, what we used to call voc ed, we were able to get a reauthorization of the Perkins Act and a modest, very small amount of additional resources. This is an opportunity to take a look at a career and technical education program and spend significantly larger amounts of money and not make it an alternative, but make it an integrated program that's going to help us with that school to college to career pipeline.
Yeah, thank you, Stan. And now that we're on the student, I want to go all the way down to the student, right? We know we're talking sort of about at the federal level what we should say, and at the state level and what schools are doing. Let's try to be as student centered now. Let's take that perspective. Traditionally, kids are asked like, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Right? What's the job that you want? And many of them are at a loss at really where to start, right? What if we ask them, what do what's important to you? What kind of changes do you want to see in the world? How can we really foster those sort of career explorations and pathway development against this backdrop of the changing workforce? Because we act as adults here, and as the older generation, we sort of know how, what they're going to want and need in the workforce. But how do we sort of change that, and what might that look like when we start to change that 180 degrees? Chuck, go ahead.
So I'd like to start where Stan ended, because if you think about that number of 50,000, or the kind of the pre-COVID kind of sense that only 4% of American high school students had access to an internship, and then if you cast that on brown and black students, the number is inequitable. We have a system that's built. And so deconstructing that system in the midst of a system that has been laid bare offers this opportunity to be more of a catalyst to equity. I know this session is really what is happening in K-12 that allows for us to consider a preferred future for kids, not the one that is really deeply embedded within public education at all levels. And Stan articulated that so well. And one tool we really firmly believe, one strategy that is in the midst of true transformation is personalized competency-based learning, right? It's that transition of having learning personalized for the needs of every child. Best example is special education. because it is a plan, right, that meets your needs where you are and where you want the student to go, that leads to those competencies that can be translated across systems and make that pathway different. Um, Grand Junction, Colorado, the D51 school district, a tour, right, of the state commissioner with a team working with the district to really think differently about teaching and learning. They're being guided, as many schools of transformation are, with those students who are really engaged in their learnings in kindergartners. And the commissioners peppering them with questions. And at the end of the tour, the kindergarten said, "Hey, do you mind if we ask you a question? You've asked us questions all day long." And the commissioner got on hands and knees and said, "Sure." Said, "Just wondering if your questions have been brought with a fixed mindset or a growth mindset to us." Well, those are the kinds of culture, the kinds of ownership, the kinds of agency uh, that really is the spark to the level of systems change. Learners will require this of us, right? If I were back as a college president in the midst of COVID, realizing that the degree of satisfaction, the degree of value orientation is going to be determined by this alignment and enabling to me to reach the objectives for both life and work. And by working together, again, I think, especially with purpose and relevance and equity at really the center of that student focus, uh, we can take many of those inhibitors out of a system and replace them with tools that actually works for every child.
Yeah, I'll respond in saying that first, what do we need for young people is we need to make sure that our teaching faculty and our administrators in schools embrace the assumption that every child will succeed, regardless of their income level, regardless of their race or ethnicity. The assumption should be that every child can succeed and that the supports are provided. And if we're looking for an opportunity to really give students the opportunity to understand career and the opportunity of career, we have an opportunity now in terms of where we're going to find the teaching staff for our schools. We're going to have a crisis. Large numbers of our teachers are retiring as a consequence of COVID, and we're going to need to recruit more teachers into the profession. This is an opportunity to look at that recruitment for second career teachers. When I was at IBM, we started a program called Transition to Teaching, where we gave our employees who were interested in an early retirement opportunity at age 54 or 55, the opportunity to have financial support to get the courses and the credential and the internship opportunities and practicum to be able to become a second career teacher. And about 100 employees took that opportunity. Many of them had successful careers in the private sector. They had advanced degrees. We have an opportunity now for the large number of people who could be moving out of the workforce to seek those second career opportunities and bring those experiences and skills and make them available to teachers, make them available to students in an effective way. And we could, as Chuck said, we could provide the incentives to be able to do that. So it's not just one example and one company, but something that could be done on a large scale leadership level. So I think for our young people, they need to understand that they can make it. They can do it. They can get their college degree. They can find their way into career, but we're going to have to support them with the changes in what we're doing. I think we have to really accelerate the process of change.
And as Stan mentions that, Lisa, one model and one partner we work directly with is the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State, who's really advancing a new workforce model for education and all those elements that Stan just articulated. The ability to work across disciplines as teams, a really critical focus on learning that is personalized, and the classrooms that inspire you are absolutely uniform in the sense that those teachers and school leaders believe that every child can succeed. It's what really accelerates the energy of what is the potential of where we're headed. But then the last is we have to think differently about career laddering for teaching, right? Because teachers have that ability to make this difference, right? And they're working under the most trying circumstances of what the world can throw at them right now. But if we think differently, about that incentivizing and the requirements of what teaching is going to look like, it should be a magnet for people to inspire to come into the field and make that difference.
And I think we're just beginning to even understand what that looks like in this post-COVID world as well. Thank you very much for spending your hour with us this afternoon. Thank you again.